Back when I was starting out with Tekken during the later years of Tekken Tag 2, I watched a video where somebody was explaining a couple of different setups with Lily. One of his friends in the video said, "Wow, that's so cheap about something," and I remember thinking then, is it really, or is it just good? What's the difference, and can something be both? I think we all run into things that we find cheap in fighting games, whether it's a character, a move, or a setup, but it's actually a pretty difficult thing to define when you try to break it down. I've been thinking a lot about it lately, and so I thought we might do a video exploring the subject a little bit together. For that purpose, I've just picked two characters here who tend to be considered really cheap by most people, but I just want to be clear that I'm not trying to pick on Noctis or Katarina players here. I play a lot of Katarina myself, by the way. They're just going to serve as sort of useful tools while I sandbox this a little bit on the stage. Now, I think a good place to start if we're going to try and define something is just the meaning of the actual word. And if you look up cheap in an Oxford English dictionary, it has the usual definition of inexpensive or something bought at a low price. But it has one more definition that I think is a lot more useful when we're talking about video games. And it goes like this: of little worth because achieved in a discreditable way, requiring little effort. And I think with just a little bit of modification, that can be a really good definition when we're talking about cheapness in Tekken. It starts out with of little worth, and I think that's the problematic part. If we're gonna measure the worth of something in Tekken, that should probably be measured by how much damage it deals or to what extent it allows you to win. And something cheap in this game can do a lot of damage and really be the difference between winning and losing, providing that it is successful. So if we change that to something like, let's say, low respectability, we're really getting somewhere. If it goes of low respectability because achieved in a discreditable way, requiring little effort, I think that's a pretty useful definition of cheapness in a game like Tekken, and I'm going to carry that into the game now and talk about a couple of the different ways that something can be cheap in this game. I'm going to start out with the most sort of basic and easy to understand one, because it's just the concept of cheap damage. If you're in any given situation where any given character would typically deal a certain amount of damage and a lot more damage is dealt, that can feel very cheap because the damage is bought at the exact same price as more balanced damage would typically be, and so that excess of damage comes across as cheap. The example that always pops into my head when I think about cheap high damage is, for some reason, and again I'm not trying to pick on specific characters, but it's Law's wall combo. It doesn't matter how many times I play against Law online, every single time he carries me to the wall and I eat that final hit of his wall combo, my jaw always drops at how large a chunk it tears out of my life bar. But there are a lot of examples of this. Katarina can get a guaranteed access ramp off of this stomp at the wall. That is, at least has a little bit of an element of execution. I don't know if Law's wall combo does, by the way. I've never tried it. So there are balancing factors to them, but the damage always feels a little bit out of proportion. But you can come up with many examples of this, whether it's Geese turning a parry into a full death combo, or Hwarang hitting you with his power crush for a massive combo. But it's just any time where the damage feels like it is bought at a low price, but you get a really high reward just in terms of the sheer damage that is dealt. The next kind of cheapness I want to talk about, and I think this is really interesting specifically in Tekken 7, is that a move can have cheap crush properties, and I think this is sort of where you find a lot of the poster children for moves that are considered cheap. You find the Matterhorns and the lightning screws and so on. One move that has very cheap crush properties is Katarina's hop kick. I think this is going to be a pretty good example, because a hop kick is typically used for its low crush properties, or just because it's the fastest launcher the character has access to in any given situation. That's the case with Katarina, by the way. But if you look at, for example, this situation where Noctis is attacking me with his back 1-2, and I apply the hop kick after the second hit on block, you can see that this hop kick is going to consistently high crush in this situation every single time. And so while this is a move that is designed to be good for low crushing, it just happens to have in its animation a couple of frames of pretty consistent high crush, and it can make the move feel extremely cheap. I think the reason crush properties feel so cheap in this game are because they cover a lot of bases and do not necessarily require you to have a plan or a lot of knowledge or any working prediction or read of what is about to happen next. If I perform a move that has both low and high crush properties, then if I get lucky and my opponent just happens to perform a low or a high that gets crushed by that move, I get to capitalize with a full combo. But usually I was panicking into that move, or maybe I was just confused and tried something and it happened to work out in my favor. That can feel really cheap when it happens, especially with moves that have crush properties that seem unreasonable or out of the norm. For example, moves that crush both highs and lows at the same time, or moves that go under mids, for example, and stances like Art of Phoenix from Xiao Yu, which will consistently go under mids. So will a couple of Katarina's lows, where if you look at her animation when she's crouching here, this is crushing highs, but it will get hit by mids. But when she does one of these lows, you can see just how far to the ground she is compared to her crouch, and this will allow her to go under a lot of different mids, including down jab. So that's an example of why crush properties can feel so extremely cheap. Another category of really cheap moves that I want to talk about are moves that have really cheap safety. They are extremely low risk but extremely high reward or potential reward. And I think a good example of this will be this signature launcher from Noctis, the down back 1+2. Now you can tell that while this move is punishable on block, if I'm really close to Noctis when he performs it, I can actually get an access ramp here for 25, which is pretty good. But when I'm this close to Noctis, he typically will not be using this move. He either applies it after a sidestep at a range when we're spaced out, or for Oki. And when I'm out here at a range where the move will typically be used, you can tell that I cannot actually punish this on block. It's I don't know if there's some move I might have that will be capable of it, but not consistently as far as I know, and that's the case for most characters in the game. When this move connects for Noctis, it is obviously a really big launcher and it's going to lead to huge damage, but he doesn't run a huge risk of eating damage when he is performing it. Now, the way you're supposed to deal with this move, and this is just my theory, is you're probably supposed to move around it using sidestep movements because of the move's linearity. But as you can tell right here, if I'm at a sort of mid-range for the move, even if I'm trying to react or predict the move and step it, most of the time it's actually just going to catch me anyway. If I time it well and I start walking at the right time, I can get around this move, but even then, as you saw right there, I do run the risk of getting caught. If I step when I'm really close to Noctis, I have a larger chance of successfully evading it, but then again, that's not a range where he typically uses the move. And so what will happen most of the time when this move is being used is the opponent will just stand block it because they don't want to run the risk of eating that big launcher just because they attempted the sidestep. They're not confident enough that the sidestep is going to work, so they just stand block. And for that reason, it works out as being an extremely high reward and extremely low risk move. And that can feel really cheap because all you need to do is guess wrong as the opponent, and you're going to go for a big ride. And all the person who's using the cheap safe move has to do is basically try the move over and over, and sooner or later it's just going to work out for them. And there are a couple of moves like this we could talk about that are considered cheap by most people in the community, such as Brian's Orbital. That's a good example of a move that has both cheap crush properties and cheap safety in my opinion. But his 3+4, for example, is a move that is difficult to punish properly, can be used at a range, and will lead to really big rewards on counter, for example. But there are many examples of moves like that. When we're talking about cheapness, it feels like, based on the terminology, that we want somebody to pay with some sort of currency for the good properties or the high damage that they get. And I think one currency you can use to pay for that is with high risk. And if you're playing with really low risk moves, then it doesn't feel like you earn the move when it connects. It feels like it was just statistically probable that it would hit sooner or later, provided that you keep on repeating it over and over. The other way and last way a move can be really cheap in this game that I want to talk about is going to carry into the concept of semi-seeable or seeable lows, like this down back 3, or if we're talking about Noctis, another really good example is his down back 2. These moves are reactable, and when they get reacted to, you're going to duck and launch them for really high damage, but that can be difficult to do for the opponent. The opponent has to do that properly in order to be able to deal with the move. However, performing a low like this, or even a bigger low like that, just requires that you know what button to press. It's not difficult whatsoever, and this is a recurring theme that you see in a lot of moves that are considered cheap. All I have to do to perform the move and create a very dangerous situation for the opponent is press a button, and then I put all of the difficulty in the hands of my opponents. I'm doing something that isn't difficult at all, even though it might be high risk, such in the case of a low like this. But the opponent now has to either have the knowledge or the reaction time or the discipline or the execution of dealing with it properly. And that's why you get a lot of simple characters like Katarina and Noctis being considered cheap, because they can just do really, really dangerous things that might have there might be ways of dealing with them that are, proper. However, the opponent needs to know how to do that and be able to do that. But all I have to do as the person who is applying a lot of cheap things is just apply those cheap things and press the right buttons, and I'm placing the entire burden of playing proper Tekken in the hands of my opponents. And I think that's a recurring theme that you see across a lot of moves or characters that are considered really cheap in the game. We spoke a little bit about the different currencies with which you can pay for the good properties that you get, and I mentioned that one way you can pay for that, in my opinion, is with high risk. I think a good example of that could, for example, be this down 4-2 from Noctis right here. This move is very, very good for a fast mid launcher because it has extreme range, much better range than most launchers in its class. However, it is made up for by the fact that, as you can see right there, I can actually launch punish this with a 15-frame launcher. It is a launch punishable move. And so this move is going to feel a lot less cheap because Noctis actually has to take a significant risk when he is applying it. So if he doesn't have a plan and doesn't know what he's doing, then he runs the risk of getting launched. And I think that's a very good way of making somebody pay for good properties, and it's why a lot of the cheapest moves in the game are so cheap, or work out as being cheap for the player who uses them. I think there are a couple of different currencies with which you can pay for your properties, therefore making the move feel less cheap, and one of them is execution. If I could just press down 4-2 with Katarina right here and perform a perfect Electric Wind Godfist, it would probably be considered one of the cheapest and most broken moves in this game. However, because a real Electric Wind Godfist has an element of execution to it, you need to spend enough time in practice mode to learn how to perform one. You have paid with some sort of currency, and you have sort of earned the right to those really powerful properties for that reason, and that is why a move like the Electric Wind Godfist, while it has some completely spectacular properties as a move, tends not to be referred to as cheap. It can feel very frustrating, and you can be very annoyed with the fact that it's being applied. I certainly am a lot of the time. But it doesn't get referred to as cheap because you do pay in some way. I think the final sort of currency I want to mention that you can use to pay for the properties of your move is knowledge. Knowledge is like the cousin of execution in this game, but I want to go back to the example of the hop kick, crushing the back 1-2 from Noctis right here. And this is going to be sort of my final argument, and it's going to illustrate why I think that cheapness is sort of a difficult concept to define in this game, because if you were watching a match where I was playing Katarina against Noctis and this exact scenario here happened, you might think it is very, very cheap that this hop kick just went straight through this string and it might seem extremely lucky or random or like panic. But if you find out later that I actually have labbed this matchup a lot, or I've played against a lot of Noctis players, and I know that the frame data situation here allows me to crush this consistently with the hop kick every time, which is what I'm doing right here, by the way, you might realize that it's actually some knowledge on my part that I have acquired by practicing and thinking about this situation, and all of a sudden a situation that might have looked extremely cheap feels a lot less cheap. However, it could also be the case that I was just trying to spam out a hop kick as fast as possible and panicking because I just want to get something out there so I can win the round, in which case this snare is going to start looking a lot cheaper. And I think the hop kick right here is another good example, or one good example of how a move can be both very, very good and very cheap. That's one of the questions I sort of asked in the beginning. Can something be both good and cheap? And I think the answer to that is definitely yes, because this is one of the best hop kicks in the game, and I think your best launcher with this character. And so you can't take it away from the character because she would be so much worse. And if you are trying to play some sort of super honorable Katarina and not use the hop kick, you're not going to do very well because it's an essential move to the character. However, it does, depending on the scenario, depending on what is happening on the screen, also some really, really cheap properties to it. And I think if we've answered the question whether or not a move can be both good and cheap, maybe we should pose the question, can something be both bad and cheap? And I think the answer to that is definitely yes as well. And I think a good example of that would be these knockdown lows that I mentioned earlier. They're not typically considered extremely powerful or good moves, especially in high-level play, because of the big risk involved with applying them. But if you connect with this at the wall with Katarina, you're going to get a free access ramp for really high damage. It is useful and it can be very, very powerful, but it would definitely be considered cheap because it's high damage and it places a burden of knowledge, execution, and reaction time on the opponent. But it's not necessarily a really great move or a really powerful move in really high level play where you assume that your opponent has that reaction time and that execution. So that's going to wrap up my little discussion and the sort of thoughts that were swimming in my head the last couple of days when I was thinking about the concept of cheapness. The final word I want to leave you with is, if you happen to be playing a character or using a playstyle where you get accused of cheapness a lot, you can never choose whether or not you are perceived as cheap. You can never choose the perception somebody has of your character, but you can choose what kind of game or what kind of Tekken you want to play and what kind of player you want to be. And I think you should focus on trying to play a game where you feel like you're improving, where you feel like you are applying strategy. If you feel like there's a lot of randomness to what you're doing, like you're acting in confusion and panic a lot of the time, it's probably a good idea to rethink your strategy. But if you genuinely are trying to play the best Tekken you can and you're trying to learn, you really can't worry about what other people say about you and whether or not they give you sort of pissy opinions, because ultimately you are playing the game for your own personal enjoyment, and I think that's very important to remember. One final thing I want to mention before I end the video is I made a video a couple of days ago where I more or less roasted an IGN review of Tekken 7. I thought that was a sort of fun and goofy idea, and the video was very well received. However, I also got a couple more dislikes than I usually do on one of my videos, and it seemed to be because a lot of people felt it sounded a little bit pissy and negative and critical, felt a little bit like I was swinging down, and I just wanted to say that I watched it back and I sort of felt that kind of texture was in the video, and I really don't want to become one of those YouTubers that goes on his channel to complain about things he doesn't like. I was just trying to do something goofy and make a couple of jokes, but I'm going to be a little bit more careful about that in the future, because my main motivation for making these videos is I want people to be inspired to try and stick with Tekken and play it more. I want more people to come to the game, and I want to do some sort of small service to the community if I can, and I just want to talk for fun about my favorite video game. So I'm going to try and be aware of that a little bit more in the future, because I don't want this to be a place of negativity. So I just wanted to mention that quickly. Thank you so much for watching this video anyway. I really do appreciate you being here. We're quickly heading for 20,000 subscribers, which is unimaginable to me. It's extremely, extremely fun. And I'm looking forward to making so many more videos for you guys. I mean, I think the new topics that pop up in my head, they just keep on, multiplying. But hopefully I'm going to catch up with all the things that I want to make for you sooner or later. For now, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again very soon. Bye bye for now.